and more specifically around script injection. So this is your inner HTMLs, your insert adjacent HTMLs, where the platform might not know where that code is coming from, and they might not know that there's inline script that will be immediately executed once it gets inserted into the DOM.
Got it. So is it something that in the philosophy is about being super safe, because you don't know that code, so when the application goes through the Windows Store certification, there's no way to verify that piece of code that will end up in the application being injected by that piece of JavaScript code, right?
Right, that's correct, yeah. And so, as part of that is that we're considered in the local host. So those files are actually installed in the application package, and those go through the store and they go through certification. And so the end user will know that any JavaScript application that they download from the store is considered a safe and verified application. As soon as you allow remote code running from some remote server somewhere, you break that trust.
Okay. Great. So the code is dumped in the function here in your application here. Breaks.
Yes.
What do you do?
What do you do? Okay. Well, the first thing you do is you can go actually look at the error message, and you can actually see the details of how to actually not work around, but work with the security policies that we've put in place. Could be assuming you're using your own JavaScript library, right? Right, yeah. Or even
you want to inject without even using something from the outside.
Even your own code might want to talk to your server and get some remote script that you need to auto-update very quickly that you won't be able to push through the store. And if you trust that content, then there are some things that you can do to allow that content to run. But that's in very specific cases. And so this documentation kind of walks you through some of the various mechanisms that are allowed in that context to work with the platform to enable that type of functionality.
Are they specific? So you mentioned inner HTML. Are there specific APIs you can think of like that are to be flagged as, okay, you might have an issue if you have that in your JavaScript framework?
Yes, and so actually this one's a great one where it talks about the automatic script filtering. This is actually the exact same example that we've been talking about, especially with doing append childs, inserts, any type of I'm adding more markup to my document, essentially, that may or may not have inline script. And so by default, we do try to do some filtering and try to make some inert script, but we give you some of the tools that allow you to do that if you are familiar with that code base and the code that you're using to actually declare that it's safe content. And so I believe as we scroll down here, there's a couple of methods here where it's to static HTML, where you can still do inner HTML, but by calling this function, it makes all of your script tags inert, essentially, so that you're not actually running any inline script.
So you're doing a conscious decision of doing that, right? As a developer.
Yes. And so if you're working with your own code, that might be very easy to do. But if you're working with a third-party library, then it's like you have to go through a whole bunch of someone else's project, issue a pull request, have a conversation, which might take a while because they have their own backlog that they're working through. And
then you end up working your own fork. And then when the main branch changes, you break your own fork. And so we know the story.
Yeah. But one of the things that I'd like to mention is that I think we work directly with jQuery to help alleviate this issue.
Yeah, so actually Microsoft Open Technologies, when we're looking at the first release of Windows 8 and with the newly arrived JavaScript HTML5 support a year and a half ago, Microsoft Open Tech was in deep integration and work with various open source communities out there. And what we wanted to do is to say, okay, so what are the most used JavaScript framework? Let's go out and contribute to them to make them just work on the Windows app platform. So we did that with jQuery, and since jQuery 2.0, the contribution from Microsoft OpenTech make jQuery compatible with the security model on Windows Store apps. So that's good, works well. To be honest, it's a lot of maintenance on the jQuery side of things, and the contributions, we have to follow up on them, making sure that it's still there. Things are broken, we have to refix them. So that's obviously something that is impacted by the actual culture of the web developers, where doing this kind of thing, injecting dynamic HTML and manipulating the DOM are very powerful, and there are things that developers commonly use.
Yeah.
So fighting against that, as in trying to educate the developers, changing the way of developing, will take time. And in that case, after contributing to jQuery 2.0, we're just like, okay, so we won't go out and ourselves contribute to every other JavaScript framework. How about we adapt things on our side? Let's start with a shim, very commonly used in the web development, and see how we can, appease or make it less a problem for web developers to integrate the JavaScript code. And this is where the JavaScript Compat library is coming.
Yes, exactly. And we recently released this at, was it OSCON, I believe, was one of the conferences?
Summer.
Yeah, this summer. And so in order to kind of help bring this solution to all types of JavaScript libraries, our team worked on building this Windows Store JavaScript compat shim. And so if you go to, and it's open source, it was released by MS OpenTech, and you can see here our main GitHub. We talked about that very similar error that you'll see when building applications.
And I'm seeing some names of commonly used JavaScript frameworks, and we see Angular, Ember, Notcats. These are not just like the random ones. They're the ones that are used on actual websites today in mass,
traction.
production.
Yeah, exactly. And so, as this starts to scale out, I mean, there's Dojo, there's Backbone, you just can start listing off the JavaScript libraries. And so obviously it's not scalable for us to go talk to each one of those guys. And then we'll be, getting requests to say, oh, well, no, talk to my favorite JavaScript library, please, Microsoft. And so that's exactly what this shim was made for.
Got it.
And so the nice thing about this is that you just get the shim, and then you just include it.
I like the description of the problem is like 10 paragraphs. Instructions is like 2 lines.
Yes.
Show us.
Here's the solution. So hopefully in this application here, so let's go to the default. I've already included the shim here, and so if I uncomment this line, hopefully the demo gods will be with me here. And so hopefully when I click go, my app is up and running. I don't see the error, and now I can start building an Angular app on the Windows platform. And we think that's goodness.
Yeah. So that means that load time, so that the Windows app platform, when loading the JavaScript framework, didn't see any issue, right, with the code in there. And this is because you put the JS Compat library just before.
Right.
So eventually I'm curious to see a bit about the code of that library to see what it does, because the magic that happens here, kind of like making safe things that are unsafe, is very interesting.
Right, yes, exactly. And so one of the things that we'll look at before is that we're actually using the same platform-supported APIs that we have documented here in this MSDN documentation about building secure applications.
Okay.
And so
there's nothing magic Microsoft-y in there. It's just like anyone could have done that library, actually. We're just like contributing that to the community for making their life easier, right?
Exactly. Good. And so we looked at kind of the common cases that web frameworks, the patterns that they used in terms of putting dynamic elements and scripts into the DOM. And so we can kind of step through some of this here, but you can kind of already start to see that we're kind of stubbing out some of these DOM manipulation APIs here. And as I scroll down just a little bit, you can see this is some helper code here that helps empty some things. But now you can start to see inserted JSON HTML. This is a fun one here where you can actually start putting in different strings of HTML in different parts of your document. And you can see that we're stubbing out these calls so that it'll actually go through our shim first before reaching the DOM. And so we actually do a cleanse of that code that's very similar to the code that is done in the platform. But for certain patterns that we've seen done in JavaScript libraries that we believe that are safe, and we've looked at them and we've validated them across other JavaScript libraries as well with this shim to allow some of that content to go in, but still maintaining the level of security and thus maintaining the same level of trust that an end user can expect when downloading that application.
Great. Okay. So that means you're not inserting a security flaw into your app doing that and using that script.
Right, exactly.
Okay. And so and when it comes to basically, if you have code that is not compliant and it's flagged as unsafe, you cannot not only just run the app, but you can't go through the store certification, right? So you just cannot publish. So how about now when you have the JavaScript compat library in your code? So basically, you're still in your code using the usual APIs that are unsafe, and you have the JavaScript compat library in front of it. Is it because you're using the JS compat library from the Microsoft OpenText project that you're allowed through the store? Is it something that actually flags that one as safe? And if you're using your own mechanism to do, like tags as safe the code, is that a difference? Do you have to use that JavaScript library compat actually to go through the store? That's, I think, the question.
Right. Yeah. So there's no secret sauce or no magic. We're using the platform in the way that it was designed and intended, and so you yourself could have written this shim if you wanted to, and still pass store certification. We did it in a way that we believed would help most and address most of the pain points of developers using third-party libraries. Yeah. So there's no secret sauce. No, this is the special JavaScript clear list that you can use for applications.
Great. So in the same order, of idea, that means that you still, as a developer, have to be careful what you put in your code, right? It's not a pass. Yeah. It's not a pass to just do whatever you want in your code and expose the user data on the application to any to issues.
Yes, no, that's very important. And so you as a developer should be very conscious of the code that you actually include. Have at least an understanding of what it's doing and how it's manipulating the application. Because essentially it's your job to ensure that the actions that you're partaking are trustworthy to end user.
Now, that said, there's a topic I want to relate to the overall day today, which is about cross-platform development.
Yes.
So is that issue with the security model something that is specific only to the Windows Store platform, or can we consider that there are other platforms trying to use JavaScript to do native apps or to exploit the same kind of model that will be exposed to the same kind of issue?
Yeah, I think actually we're seeing this today with Chrome apps. They have a similar concept of running HTML and JavaScript and CSS locally as an application, and they in fact also have a security policy. The CSP is their security policy, and so I think for moving forward for HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript locally run applications that aren't in a web sandbox are going to face these issues moving forward. So this isn't a Microsoft only thing, a Windows only thing. Okay. It's a matter of ensuring that we're protecting end users for these locally run applications that could run remote JavaScript from a remote server.
Great. And so I have a last question that just came up during the discussion, so unscripted. So
fantastic.
Now, still in the context of developing a cross-platform application, let's say I'm using Cordova and I target iOS, Android, Windows, and I'm using Angular. And as you demoed, just dumping Angular in my Cordova app will certainly bring that alert message and my application as is will not work on Windows.
Right.
Now I'm adding the JS compat library. What's going to happen for iOS and Android? Will they just discard things in terms of the JavaScript library, or should I actually have some code that says, if I'm on Windows platform, use this library, if not, don't use it?
Right, and so we've gone ahead and we've done that for you. And so if you look in our...
It was unscripted, but you were ready for that.
I know. I was like, oh, it's perfect. It's lobbing it up and I'm just going to knock it out of the park. So we do the checks for you. And so we look to see if we're in the Windows local context. And if we are, then we will apply that needed filtering. If we're not, then we won't do it because we know that we are not in the Microsoft local context. If we're in an iOS or an Android app, we're going to be in the web context. And so the web context will essentially safeguard the end user from that code. And so you're able to use it without any negative impacts to maintenance your application. So you don't have to have a separate index.html in your merges folder, for example, just for Windows to include this one script, and in your other applications you don't need to actually have that reference.
That's perfect. That's very much like cross-platform thinking. That's great.
Right. It's hopefully the write once, run anywhere mentality. Yeah.
Awesome. Love it. So what does it mean for the future? I mean, we have a solution here, which is in the form of a shim, and shim are known for being temporary things and solutions. what's going on for the next version? I know we can't spoil too much about what's going on for the next app platform, but I'm wondering in which direction is it going in terms of the security model, needing, not needing such a shim. Can you share a little bit about that?
I can talk a little bit about that in the sense that we know that there's a developer pain point, and it's our job to remove those pain points from the system. As well as we're looking at other platforms and looking at their security models, and we're trying to understand what's the best mix of the level of security and the level of productivity for developers. And so in the future, we hope to address developer pain points and make sure that we have models in place that give you that right balance of security and productivity for your applications. So.
Awesome, great. Yeah. Well, thanks, Paul. I guess you are now getting ready for your next session at Win.js, where once again we're going to talk about cross-platform using web technologies. Thanks for this great talk about the JavaScript compact library. I'm having a hard time saying the name of that compact.
We love complex names at Microsoft.
Yeah, exactly. JS. What is the full name, by the way?
I have to actually look it up. I don't know it off the top of my head.
That's the worst.
Yes, the JavaScript Dynamic Content Shim for Windows Store apps.
Awesome. Great. Okay, so that was a talk about this thing. And we'll look forward to see you for the next one for Win.js. Still with Paul. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, welcome back. I'm Paul Gilday. You might have seen me on the previous module. And so I'm here with Edgar Banguero. And today we're going to be talking about building cross-platform applications with Win.js. So Edgar, please introduce yourself.
So hi, I'm Edgar Banguero. I'm a senior software engineer here in the Win.js team. Working at Microsoft for almost 8 years in different web services, such as what is now known as Outlook.com and OneDrive. Previously, I worked on the Windows Web Apps platform, building the framework that enables developers to build applications in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Most recently, I worked with Paul and the Win.js team in our effort to bring the Win.js library cross-platform and ensuring that it works well in every, like in Safari, in Chrome, in every browser, and especially with Cordova applications. And then I'm from Colombia, so I will add Spanish to the list of accents that you heard this morning. So let's get started.
Yeah. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to cover a little bit about what's Win.js, what's going on in Win.js. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive in some of these Win.js concepts, especially around our control model. And then once we've kind of learned those things, I'm going to hand it over to Edgar, and Edgar's going to show us a demo app that we built using Apache Cordova, Win.js, and we can kind of dissect it and show you the stuff that we've been doing to enable Win.js cross-platform. And so the first thing that we're going to talk about is what is Win.js? And within that, I'm just going to give you a brief intro and show you kind of where our roadmap is. So Win.js today is a set of JavaScript toolkits. And we have two main toolkits. And the first toolkit is really around UI controls and widgets, specifically high-polished widgets that are centered around performance. And we believe that these widgets are great aspects to your application because we've designed them with with all of touch, keyboard, mouse accessibility built right into the UI components. On the other side, we have lots of infrastructure so that you can scaffold out your application. We have things like a scheduler that lets you schedule all of your tasks for your UI and allows you to coordinate calls across it. We have data binding. We have a promises implementation that's very compatible with the new ES6 promises that are coming. And we have pages infrastructure. So a lot of good infrastructure to actually build up your application. And so many of you might not know is that we actually started this back in Windows 8 and with Win.js 1. And so this was originally a JavaScript library that developers used to build Windows 8 applications. And so if you look at our timeline here, fast forward to April, this past April at the Build conference, we announced that we were partnering with Microsoft OpenTech. Microsoft OpenTech released Win.js as an open source project, and we announced that we were going to take the project cross-browser and cross-device. This past September, we actually had our first cross-platform, cross-device release with Win.js 3.0, where we have a support matrix of a slew of desktop and mobile browsers. We worked heavily on making it modular and making sure that you could get it from your various package managers that you use today, with all the other JavaScript libraries that you know and love. And so that's where we are in the future. You can kind of see what we're thinking about. And we're on GitHub, and we encourage you to go there and participate with us, issue pull requests, feature requests, what have you. We're really interested in what you, the developers, want to see in our library. And so with that, we're going to talk a little bit about some of just the basic Win.js concepts to get you up and running with a Win.js application. And so the three things that I'm going to touch on are: how do you kind of bootstrap your app with Win.js? Talk a little bit about the control model that we have so that you can instantiate controls and use them in your UI. And then we'll touch a little bit on data binding to kind of bring your application to life by marrying your data with your UI. Cool. So with that, I'm going to switch over to our try site here. And so since we went open source, you can see we have a nice plethora of controls, and Edgar's going to talk a little bit more about those specific controls. But here at the try site, we have interactive demos for you, and so hopefully I'll be able to code this demo straight up in our website. And so the first thing that I talked about was that we're going to talk a little bit about bootstrapping. And so like many other JavaScript libraries, we have a ready function, which kind of abstracts non-content loaded, document load, all that good stuff, so that you know that you're ready and up and running to run this application. We, like jQuery's $ready, we have our Win.js.application on ready function. And so the thing that we're going to do here is we're going to start building a demo. And so here I'm just going to give this demo a title here, and we'll just say rating demo. And so here we're going to actually be instantiating rating controls. And so the first thing to know about our control model is that there's three key aspects to it in order to instantiate a control. And so the first thing is you need an element. Next is you need a constructor, and then optionally you can pass an object of configuration settings for that control. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a placeholder element, and I'm going to give it a class name of rating so that we know we can select it out of the DOM for later. And so we're going to do just that. So here I'm going to create a variable, and then I'm going to use the query selector method to actually go to the DOM, and then we're going to find our rating element, and we're going to scroll that away into a variable. And so the way that we initialize this control is we just call new with a constructor. And so I'm going to initialize a rating control, and we're going to call new, and most of our UI widgets live in the UI namespace, and so that's just UI rating. And in our constructor, you can see that we need to pass an element, and so a reference to our element, as well as any options for configuration on the data. And so I'm going to pass that element that we selected out of the DOM. I'm going to pass an initial user rating. We'll set that value to, actually we'll set it to 3 in the middle here. And then we'll finish that code. And so hopefully we've instantiated a rating control. That's great. And so if you can see here, as I hover over with my mouse, you can see the tentative rating is giving me hover feedback. I can click on each of the stars to commit that user rating. I can also, if I move the mouse here, I can keyboard around to use keyboard to set that tentative rating, press enter to commit that as well. Also, you notice as I touch on the screen here, I can set ratings, and I can also scrub over top of that. And so this is just an example of the type of care that we've put into all of our controls to ensure that we have the right input modality support. So you can take a Win.js control from a phone, scale it up to a tablet, to a desktop PC, and then scale that across other devices that may or may not have keyboards and mice attached to them, or touch-first devices such as your Android and your iOS devices. So that's pretty cool. Awesome. And so I showed you the programmatic side of how we knew up a control. like many other JavaScript frameworks, we have some declarative ways of instantiating controls. And so I'm going to do that. And so interesting enough, we're actually going to build on top of this. And so before I do that, let's look over at the HTML. And so the way that, that I declare a control is the same way that I would do imperatively, is that I need an HTML element, I need a constructor, and I need options configuration. And so we decided to leverage the HTML5 data dash attributes to do this. And so I can type data win control and then pass that the same winjs.ui.rating constructor that we used in the previous example. And then to pass in our configuration data, we use data win options. And we have a very similar JSON-like syntax to do that. And so I'll say user rating, and we'll set this to 2. And then on our script side, we need to process that markup in order to instantiate that control. And we use that with the control processor, and that lives in the UI namespace. So if I type in winjs.ui.processAll, and so what this will do is when we call this, it will comb through our HTML document. It'll find all of the instances of our data win controls. It'll hook up our constructor with the options configuration, and then marry that with the HTML element that we've attributed with these attributes. And so hopefully, now you'll see that we have still our same rating control with a rating of 2. I can also add in some more configuration just to ensure that this is live running code. So I can set a max rating here, and we'll set that to 10. And so hopefully on the output here, now you can see that this output is generating and instantiating our controls with the things that we want and we need. So the final thing that I was going to talk a little bit about is data binding. And if you'll see in our future sample that we do a lot of data binding in our application. We think this is kind of a first-class concept. And so we talked about programmatic side, the declarative side of control instantiation. And so we have similar concepts for binding as well. And so I'm going to choose to just kick off with some declarative data binding. And so we use the same data dash attributes. So I'll type in data win bind. And for our binding expressions, we can bind to essentially anything that's a property in the JavaScript domain. And so we think this is really handy so that as you become more comfortable with our binding system, anything that you can bind to, any property that you can set in JavaScript essentially becomes a bindable property in our binding system. And so in this specific case, I'm going to bind to the ratings, the user rating property. And the way that we do that is that there's a well-known property that we apply to HTML elements called the win control property. And this gives us an instance to our control. And then off of that, I can bind to a user rating. And so this expression is property : source. And so we're going to pass in some data, and we'll show you that on the other side of the imperative side. And we're going to set that to our data and our rating value. So let's go back over into our script, and let's kind of set up some of our data here. And so let me click here, and we'll put this down here. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a namespace. I'm going to use WinJS's namespace define function. We're going to create the namespace app. Inside of that app namespace, we're going to create a context object. Inside of that context object, we're going to have a data object, and that's all we need. And so the interesting thing with our binding, like our control instantiation, there's kind of 3 key parts that you need to understand when using data binding. And those parts are: is you have some data object. That could be an array, it could be an object with properties on it. You have some piece of UI that has properties that you want to bind to. And then we wrap that together with an observable proxy that kind of connects those 2 things together. And then as you update that observable proxy, the UI will update for your binding. And so actually what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of preset some of this stuff up, and I'm going to have an event handler, and we're going to call this we'll set this up as our add1 event handler, because we're going to be changing some values. And WinJS actually has a nice little helper function here that marks our event handler supported for processing. And so we'll leave this empty for now, but this will help us set up in the future. Perfect. Okay, great. And so now you can imagine after you've called process all, which is an asynchronous method, so this returns a promise. And so once that promise completes, we need to go do some work. And so some of that work is that you can imagine going to talk to your data service on the back end, get some JSON blob, do a JSON.parse on it, and now you have some object model that you want to bind to your UI. And so in lieu of doing all that, we'll just bind to some static data. And so the way that we do that is we use win.js.binding.as. And so we're just going to pass this in an object that has a rating property, and we'll set that rating to 6 here. So actually, no, we'll set it to 1. So we'll want to show some of the cool binding stuff. Great. And then what we'll do is we'll export